Chapter 1. It didn't sound real, but it was her ship now. What a strange gift. It took 2 days to clean the last chunks of her deceased friend, Thalu, out of the shuttle. She spent the remaining 6 weeks of her journey alternating between watching videos and memorizing the manuals for the shuttle and her new ship. By the time she finally arrived at Hyrule, in the Havras system, she was eager for a change of scenery. Kayla checked in with orbital security, maneuvered into high orbit, headed down to the shuttle bay, and before long was on her way down to the surface. It finally struck her. Valk was long dead, Vance and were on Midguard, and Bookworm was off somewhere directing the new alliance in their fight against the old factions. This had once been her home, but she had no one now. After docking her shuttle at the starport, she walked over and stood in the long line leading up to the customs counter. Technically she, herself, was still on Midguard as well, and would be for at least another year. It would be some time before the old Kivaza would eventually fail her master Sadakar's final test. Time travel confuses everything, but at least she hadn't arrived a few months earlier and crossed her own path. Granted, she left and arrived in the same ship, but the notion still amused her, despite the impossibility. The line slowly moved forward as she was swept away by her thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder, if she'd been able to say one thing to her former self, what would it be? She smiled to herself. "I wouldn't change a thing," she whispered as she stepped up to the customs counter. "Welcome to Hyrule," chimed the customs agent. "Well, maybe one thing," Kayla said and then began to laugh. The customs agent watched her nervously as Kayla continued to laugh. The girl behind the counter took a deep breath and, with all the perkiness she could manage, said, "Welcome to Hyrule. Do you have anything to declare?" It was the same customs agent that had greeted her when she'd first returned from the Psionic Research Institute, PR, roughly 3 years earlier. The synchronicity of it all just seemed too absurd. Maybe it was mental fatigue from the long journey, a release from all the stress she'd been under, or the isolation of her journey home. Whatever the cause, Kayla just couldn't stop laughing. "Well, I don't have all day. Do you have anything to declare?" Kayla reached over and grasped the handle of a square, metallic box on the robotic luggage cart which had followed her from the docking bay. "Would you like me to call security?" the customs agent asked with her usual pleasant smile. The woman behind the counter studied her quizzically. "Yes, please," Kayla said through gales of laughter, as she placed the box on the counter. "What's that?" the girl asked. "Just a little head," Kayla said, while trying to regain her composure. "Would you like me to call security?" the customs agent asked again. "Yes, please, you do that." Kayla roared with laughter, as she pressed a button on the handle. The panels on the sides shot downward, revealing the contents of the cryopreservation chamber. A crudely severed head stared blankly at the customs agent from behind the glassy inner lining of the container. The customs girl pressed a button behind the counter. Her lip turned upward slightly on one side. She was clearly looking forward to security arriving. Kayla took a deep breath and tried, yet again, to stop laughing. The girl behind the counter repeatedly pressed the alert button. Kayla's laughter seemed to echo throughout the otherwise quiet room. She knew she was making everyone else uncomfortable, but she just couldn't stop, and the smug grin on the girl's face wasn't helping. She felt someone nearby trying to scan her surface thoughts. She silently scolded herself. The other telepath must have used empathic projection to compel her to find far more humor in the situation than was merited. This distraction had allowed them to slip past her natural defenses undetected. She wasn't amused. She looked around the room, looking for the offending telepath. "That was rude," she said as she directed her attention to the 2 guards who were swiftly approaching. The uninvited scan had ruined her mood. Both of the guards were from fairly common bipedal species. One was a dog-like caiman with floppy ears, the other was a massive iguana-like gorgalian. Kayla narrowed her eyes to adjust her visual acuity. Neither one of them were telepaths. "Who's your friend?" she asked with a crooked grin as they drew up in front of her. "Ma'am," the Cayman said with a note of unease, "what do you mean?" The Gorgalian took only a momentary glance at the preserved head in the container. Bounty hunters had never been a rarity on the planet of Hyrule, but now that Project Acorn had taken control, such things must have become commonplace. Once refocused, her eyes were able to perceive a broader, normally invisible, spectrum. "Over there," Kayla said as she pointed toward a ghostly, nearly imperceptible, blue glow next to a nearby column. "The Ilanjani." She couldn't know if she'd properly identified the alien, but it seemed to be a safe bet. Nobody else seemed to notice them. They were strangely absent from the room monitoring display behind the customs counter. She couldn't sense their mind, or see them conventionally. It was only due to the unique visual capabilities she had inherited from her Eldaron ancestry that had allowed her to locate it at all. She hadn't seen the Ilanjani itself, merely the faint telepathic field it was emitting. "Is he one of yours?" The Gorgalian shifted uneasily. "There's no such thing," the Cayman scoffed. "We'll ask the questions," the Gorgalian said gruffly. The Ilanjani began moving away from them, staying close to the wall. "Who are you?" the Cayman demanded. "Do you have Ilanjani on staff?" Kayla snapped, "or are they a spy for the Information Society?" "No," the Gorgalian replied, "we do not." "I'll be right back," Kayla said forcefully. The guards both reached for her. "Not until you tell us who you are and what your business is here," the Gorgalian demanded. She easily avoided the Cayman's grasp, only to be seized firmly by the Gorgalian, whose arms were much longer than she'd anticipated. "It's getting away," Kayla snapped, as she watched it hasten its escape. "Not until you tell us who you are and what your business is here," the Gorgalian said in a deep commanding tone. "Lady Darkseid," she answered in accordance with Labartha's instructions. Their posture changed the instant she said the name. The Gorgalian lowered his head as he spoke. "We need proof. Come with us." "First, I'm going to deal with that Ilanjani," Kayla said. "After that, I'll be more than happy to come with you." "That's not how things work here," the massive reptile said as its grip tightened on her arm. "I think you should let her go," the Cayman said nervously. "What if it's not really her?" the Gorgalian hissed. "What if it is?" the Cayman said in a hushed tone. She cursed quietly as the Ilanjani rushed around a corner and out of sight. "Please, come with us," the overgrown iguana commanded. "It's too late," Kayla sighed irritably. "They're gone now." "Sorry, ma'am," the Cayman's floppy ears lowered slightly as it spoke. She could feel fear emanating from the canine, but his reptilian counterpart was clearly determined to follow procedure. Neither of them had the ability to mask their thoughts or emotions. She took a deep breath and exhaled sharply. "It's a formality, but rules are rules," the Cayman said in an apologetic tone. "We need to confirm your identity," the Gorgalian insisted. "It's all right, boys," Kayla said with a forced smile. "Lead the way." "What should I do with this?" the customs agent called from behind the counter, as she motioned to the disembodied head inside the container. "Have it delivered to Justajo's," Kayla replied. "The restaurant," the woman said in dismay. "You heard her," the Gorgalian said firmly and then chortled softly as they led Kayla away. "Do you mind if I ask whose head that was?" the Cayman asked as they turned down a narrow hallway. "One of the Ravenhawk clones," Kayla said dismissively. "If that's true," the Gorgalian said appraisingly, "you could have gotten away from us if you really wanted to." "I'd rather not hurt you unless I have to," she said with a wink. They stepped into a small office across from the decontamination stalls. "What do you need?" a male Shamfarian asked from behind a desk. After their ancestral homeworld had been evacuated tens of thousands of years earlier, the Shamfarians had been the first Terran species to return to the stars, and the only one which had retained any of their ancient culture. A small stand, holding 3 swords, was prominently displayed on a small table next to the desk. It was a clear indication his family still honored their ancient traditions. Kayla bit her lip involuntarily as she studied the dark-haired Terran. He was cute. Please state your identity, the Gorgalian instructed. Lady Darkseid, Kayla answered. Truth, the Shamfarian said as he looked up in surprise. He did a double take and blushed. I was told you were expected, but I didn't expect. Expect what? Kayla said with a smile. I didn't expect to meet you, the Shamfarian said swiftly. Lie, Kayla said with a sly grin. I didn't expect her to be a Terran hybrid either, the Gorgalian said with a crooked grin. She doesn't smell Terran, the Cayman objected. Okay, the Shamfarian said abruptly, you two head back to your post. I'll take care of our special guest. The guards talked quietly among themselves as they walked back to their posts. Lady Darkseid, the Shamfarian said as he stood, please allow me to act as your escort. He looked to be in his early 20s. What's your name? Kayla asked. Shinji, he answered with a hint of nervousness. Kayla smiled warmly. Well then, Shinji, escort away. Shinji leaned over and typed something into the computer before stepping away from his desk. First, you'll have to go through decon, he said as he walked over to her. He was about 2 or 3 inches taller than her, and had a slender, muscular build. She followed him as he directed her to stall number 1. I've set the program to only run the sequences that are absolutely necessary, he explained. Just the stages dealing with potential contagions, so stages 5, 6, 10, and 11. Unfortunately, there will be a processing delay between 10 and 11. Naturally, you'll have to remove your top for the inoculation during stage 10. No problem, Kayla said as she started unfastening the straps on the top half of her armor. What are you doing? Shinji said in surprise. Taking off my top, Kayla feigned confusion as she spoke. Shinji was a telepath. He certainly knew she was teasing him, but that didn't stop her from enjoying his embarrassment. I'll close over the door. Just pass it to me through the door and I'll hold it for you until you're done. That's no fun, Kayla teased. She could sense his nervousness. He wasn't just pretending to be shy. She could feel his desire, but it didn't feel sleazy, lecherous. He feared the lust that he felt toward her, and Kayla couldn't help but enjoy the feeling of his poorly suppressed desires washing over her. It was hard to tell where his emotions ended and hers began. She'd been toying with him without understanding the fine line she was treading between temptation and provocation. Empathic abilities tend to get confused when faced with intense emotional states. Kayla found herself wondering if it was something she really wanted or if it was merely the intensity of his desire. Her tail shifted position slightly. The touch of her fur tracing along her thighs made her wonder how his hands would feel against her skin. He was blushing. Kayla wondered if he'd picked up on her thoughts but was surprised by the realization that she didn't really mind if he had. Shinji slowly closed over the door and stuck his hand through, waiting for her to pass him her top. Kayla smiled to herself. He was looking but wouldn't be able to see anything unless she stood directly within his narrow line of sight. It was as if he was giving her the choice to either be seen or not. Kayla liked her new stripes and had been waiting for an excuse to show them off, or at least that was her internal justification for stepping directly into his line of sight as she continued unfastening the section of her armor which was covering her upper body. She felt nervous, momentarily, as she undid the final strap, exposing a band of her bare flesh to him. Kayla paused and watched his eyes as he watched her through the narrow gap in the door. He wasn't looking away. She slowly pulled back the armor, revealing her breasts, and let it fall away from her arms. A moment of confusion, or perhaps curiosity, passed across his face as the coloration of her arms was revealed. From her forearms to her wrists her skin darkened rapidly through a spectrum of golden-brown hues until it reached the rich ebony hue of her hands. He must have assumed she was wearing gloves. One of Kayla's prehensile tails caught her armor before it could land on the ground behind her. She felt a moment of panic as she reached her arm behind herself and grabbed her armor away from her tail. Had he seen it? What would he think? He was still watching. Kayla rested her armor in his hand and stepped out of his line of sight. He started to pull her armor through the door. Wait, Kayla said urgently, you said stage 5, right? Yes, Shinji said, 5, 6, 10 and 11. I'll have to take off the bottom half for stage 5. Oh, you're right. Sorry, I forgot about that. He placed the top half of her armor next to the door and reached his hand back into the stall. I guess the show's over, Shinji thought sadly. Kayla didn't feel any resentment, anger, or even irritation within him, merely a quiet longing. What? Kayla asked, as she undid the straps which held her armor around her calves. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't intend to broadcast that thought. You seem sad, Kayla asked. Why? I was hoping to see the rest of your stripes, he said with a smile. Strictly speaking, the Cayman was right. She wasn't quite Terran anymore. Kayla paused to reconsider. Prior to her exposure to the changeling mutation core, she'd been indistinguishable from a Terran regardless of the secrets her genome held. I have more than just stripes under there, Kayla said nervously. She felt his emotional state change abruptly. No, Kayla said quickly, nothing like that. She stepped back within his narrow field of vision as she prepared to unfasten the last strap from around her waist. As much as she enjoyed having tails, she was afraid of being rejected because of them. He looked as nervous as she felt. She blushed involuntarily as she let her armored skirt fall away. His initial reaction was confusion at what, to him, must have looked like thick furry thighs. Kayla giggled softly as her twin brown tails lazily rolled around her legs, and her black tail unwrapped itself from her waist and hips. He watched her intently. He was confused, curious, and more than a little fascinated, perhaps from her nipple deficiency. Her black tail stretched out behind her before relaxing on the floor. Her brown tails worked together to gently pick up the bottom segment of her armor and gently lay it over his arm. Her left tail lowered to the floor, but her right tail reached out and gently stroked his forearm. He didn't move away. Kayla looked him up and down. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. His thoughts were racing as fast as his heart. Well, she asked, while feeling a little insecure. It had seemed like fun at the time, but now she just felt exposed. What do you think? He exhaled slowly, pointed at the patch of fur between her legs and asked, what about that? Kayla was confused. What about it? Do you have to take that off too? He asked hesitantly. Kayla laughed. It's attached. Is that fur? He asked with an unexpected level of excitement. Kayla grinned broadly. You can close the door now. As Shinji closed the door, he mouthed the words, thank you. The decontamination procedure began once the door had closed completely. Entering stage 5, an electronic voice from the video display said, please move appendages away from your body and hold your breath while the antibacterial mist is initiated. Kayla stood in the center of the stall and her long tails stretched out as well as they could. She held her breath as a hot blast of mist filled the stall for a full 10 seconds. Kayla exhaled. Scanning for additional bacteria. Scan complete. No bacteria found. Proceeding to stage 6, the voice said. Please place your hand on the blue panel and wait while further tests are conducted. A narrow tube entered the stall from the left wall. Please breathe into the tube to test for airborne microbes, the computerized voice said. She blew into the tube and waited for the blue light to turn green. All blood and tissue samples have been taken. Please wait while testing is conducted. The computer paused for a few seconds before continuing. I wish decon was always this quick, Kayla chuckled. Entering stage 10, inoculation. A mechanical arm swung out from a socket in one of the walls and struck her arm with a packet of a dozen microinjectors. Swelling may last several days, the video advised. Entering stage 11, final stage. Kayla smiled, that was quick. Please wait while blood test results are verified. Kayla looked down at the video display with disapproval. Too quick, she grumbled as she read the estimated wait time. Kayla walked over and stood next to the door. Shinji, she asked. Are you still there? Yes, Lady Darkseid, he answered nervously. The console here says the blood test is going to take almost 20 minutes. Unfortunately, Shinji said apologetically, that's just how long it takes. There really isn't anything I can do about it. Well, Kayla said, feeling a little embarrassed, there is one thing you could do, if you want to. Shinji was silent just long enough for her to start to become uncomfortable. What would you like me to do for you? Kayla blushed and bit her lip as she dismissed the first thought that came to mind. Can you come in here and keep me company while I wait? Yes, ma'am, he said with a combination of fear and eagerness. Kayla looked at her tails irritably as they refused to obey her. She certainly thought she wanted them to cover her naked body, but clearly they didn't agree. Kayla moved her tails out of the way and sat on the narrow bench on the wall across opposite to the display screen. Kayla laid her arm in front of her breast and glared at her tails. She hadn't actually had nipples since her transformation, but this was the first time it had made her feel self-conscious. You can come in now, she said. Shinji opened the door part way, stepped in, and quickly closed it behind himself. Here's your clothing, he said as he held out both arms while holding a section of armor in each hand. Just put it here, Kayla instructed as she patted the seat next to her with her hand. He started walking over to her. She turned her head and looked at the screen to see how much time was left. Shinji laid her armor on the bench and stood next to her. Kayla turned her head toward him then averted her eyes. Sorry, he said nervously as he stepped away from her. Where do you want me? She looked up at him, opened her mouth to answer, then closed her mouth and smirked at the expression on his face. Stop that, she scolded. That wasn't even a complete thought. It wasn't the thought, he said while blushing brightly. It was the image that went with it. Are you usually like this? She asked as he sat down on the bench a few feet away from her. Like what? She flushed. You're so nervous and shy on the surface, but just under that. Why are you grinning like that? Shinji asked. Kayla hadn't realized she was grinning, not until he mentioned it. Kayla took a deep breath and tried to regain her composure. This isn't what I had in mind when I asked you to keep me company, Kayla insisted. What did you have in mind? He asked. Kayla sighed with frustration. I had a long, lonely, miserable flight here, she admitted. I was just tired of being alone. I would have been happy to keep you company even if you hadn't stripped for me. Truth, Kayla said with a warm smile. He shrugged. I was stripping for decontamination, Kayla corrected him. I just let you watch. I should admit that I had ulterior motives, but not what you'd expect. This is a new look for me, and I wanted to show it off. I feel so used, he objected playfully. Yeah, Kayla said with a smile, I could see how much it offended you. Shinji shifted uneasily. What? Would you mind if I ask you a question? Ask as many as you'd like, Kayla teased. What are you? He asked and then added. I mean what species? Kayla had no idea how to answer. She considered the question and finally answered, unique. He looked at her with a sad amusement in his eyes, too bad. It's a good look. Is the color on your arms natural, or a tattoo like your stripes? My stripes are natural, Kayla countered. So, did you just wake up one morning with stripes? Shinji teased. Actually, Kayla blushed, I woke up one morning with stripes and tails that hadn't been there the day before. Truth, he said with a start. How can that be true? It was an interesting night. Kayla said with a shrug. If your stripes are natural, why do they look so symmetrical? They're really not. Kayla stood up, let her arm fall away from her breasts, and turned around slowly to show off her stripes. Do they all connect in the back, underneath your hair, or are they 6 separate stripes? Shinji asked. They all connect, Kayla said as she lifted up her auburn hair so he could see where they all met, just below the back of her neck. I'm a little confused by your math. I know my eyes work different than they used to, but can't you see the second set of stripes? There's a golden brown stripe just under each of the black ones. The lighter stripes even follow the muscle contour down the outside of my thighs. You can see them, can't you? Kayla angled her right leg demonstratively. I see them, Shinji said with a faint chuckle. They even have a little curve at the tips behind your knees. I was really starting to worry you couldn't see them, Kayla complained. That's the only place where the 2 colors really seem to separate, so I was counting them as part of the darker markings, but I do see them. Kayla breathed a sigh of relief. I do see what you meant about them being asymmetrical though. They don't quite match. The 2 stripes that go down under your shoulder blades in particular. The stripe on your left side goes down further than the one on the right, it is closer to your spine for the majority of its length, but the band on the right starts curving toward your side sooner. Then continues around under each breast, Kayla pointed out while raising her arms and continuing to turn, until they almost meet in the center of my chest then arch down and outward over each hip. I noticed that earlier, Shinji said with a broad grin. Did you notice where they connect again in the back? Kayla teased as she turned her back to him and wiggled her posterior. I sure did, he said with a chuckle, but I think I like the stripe on the top best, the one that goes around the back of your neck. Really? Kayla asked as she turned around to face him. Why that one? It makes a heart shape in front, he said with a faint blush. I really don't see it, Kayla said as she absent-mindedly traced the darkened line as it arched down from her clavicle to the center of the chest. It looks like a wedge splitting a circle. In half to me. It still looks like a heart to me, he said with a shrug. Kayla looked down at her chest, and slowly raised her eyes to meet his gaze. I really don't see it, Kayla mused, but at least I don't have to worry about you calling me heartless. She could feel a strange longing deep within him, buried beyond his superficial desires. She stood before him, motionless, save for the restlessly stirring of her tails. There was a conflict raging deep within the very core of her being. What's wrong? Shinji asked nervously. It's nothing, Kayla grumbled, as she raised her head and moved her silvery gray bangs to the right side of her face. Why do you ask? It's hard to explain, Shinji said with a faraway look in his eyes. Even under the bright lighting in the stall, it was as if you were standing in the darkness, looking at me out of the shadows. That probably doesn't make any sense, but it's the only way I can explain it. A moment of panic rumbled around, deep within her. Did it scare you? Shinji blushed. Not in a bad way. Kayla tilted her head in confusion. What's that supposed to mean? Just try not to look at me like that, he said as he shifted his weight slightly. Well, unless you want me to fall for you. She felt a slight shift within his emotional state. She grinned involuntarily at the fear within him. His silent wish that he hadn't revealed the nature of the quiet longing within his chest terrified him. I like it, Kayla said emphatically. Like what? Shinji asked agape. My new look, Kayla said with a playful smile. What did you think I was talking about? I was a little worried about how other people might react. I just thought I'd use you as a test run. I hope you don't mind. Does that mean I'm the first person that's seen you like this? Kayla watched his expression as she spoke. Yes. You are. She felt a wave of emotion flooding through him, and for a brief moment, it looked like he was about to cry. I'm honored, Shinji said, and he meant it. Do you mind if I ask you what you looked like before this? You weren't a lizard or anything, were you? She could tell he was teasing, but there was a hint of unease in his mind. My stripes and the tails are new, including the silver streak places hair, Kayla said with an embarrassed little smile. Other than that, not much different. He seemed relieved and even more curious. I should get dressed, Kayla said as he sat silently studying her naked body. As she reached for her armor, one of her brown tails pushed it away from her grasp and toward Shinji. Damn things have a mind of their own, Kayla said with a blush. I don't have conscious control over them. He looked up at her and asked, does that mean you subconsciously want to stay naked? Maybe, she admitted, I was the only one on the ship for over a week. I didn't see much point in wearing clothing. It could be as simple as that. Then again, they sometimes react to desires I don't even know I have, if that makes any sense. He gulped hard and cleared his throat before speaking. That sounds interesting. Did you ever use your tails to? He began to ask. Never mind. Kayla blushed brightly. Of course not. Kayla insisted, knowing full well that he could tell it was a lie, not that it's any of your business. Okay, he said while trying not to smile. They do have a mind of their own, she said with an exaggerated shrug. Kayla reached for her armor again, and once again her tails moved it away from her grasp. She sensed his heart rate quicken as she realized that she was less than an arm's length from where he was sitting. She looked down at him, and he looked away. He was hiding something from her. He was holding something back. Was she just picking up on the yearning he was struggling to ignore? Or was it just? Go ahead and ask, Kayla urged. That is what I'm picking up from you, right? You've been driving yourself crazy wanting to ask me something. What is it? I don't think I should. I can always refuse to answer, or say no, Kayla said dismissively, depending on what the question is. You'll never know if you don't ask. Kayla could feel his fear, longing, and desire washing over her. It felt empowering. He held up his hand next to his head as if he were a student nervously waiting for the teacher to call on him. Kayla smiled. He looked cute. Okay, but it may sound a little weird. He seemed scared. Just ask, Kayla insisted. Would it be okay if I felt your fur? He said as he curled his fingers slightly and moved his hand half the distance between them. It seemed like such a silly question to worry so much about. She'd already touched his arm with one of her brown tails. She suddenly realized he didn't mean that fur. Her three slender, furry, tails were all attached at the base of her spine, but her black tail had grown slightly above, and between, the other two. The twin brown tails lined up with the golden brown stripes which encircled her hips. Her black stripes, which visually looked as if they'd formed just above and slightly overlapping her lighter markings. Her ebony furred tail was attached where the dark lines, which followed the contour of her hips, met behind her. A slender band of short, black fur followed the border between her interconnected stripes from her dark tail, over her hips, and then diverged as they traced downward, and broadened, forming a wedge of dense fur between her legs. Oh, Kayla said with a start. Kayla wasn't sure how she felt about his question, or how to answer it. There was one thing for certain, the longer she waited to answer, the more awkward the situation was going to get. Kayla glanced over at the video display. Okay, just don't make it weird. Why did she say that? The whole situation was weird. She wanted to be touched, but what if this was an excuse to? He ran his fingers upward through her lush fur, curled and straightened them twice, and pulled back his hand. He had a big goofy grin plastered across his face. It felt nice but wasn't what she'd expected. Kayla wasn't sure what she'd expected, but that wasn't it. She actually felt a little disappointed. What? Kayla snapped. It really is fur, he said with a blush. It feels so nice, and it's kinda hot. Blood test results verified, no harmful organisms found, the electronic voice said. Kayla swept her armor off the bench and rushed to get dressed. She suddenly felt irritated and frustrated but wasn't entirely sure why. Each of her long brown tails wrapped around one of her legs as her black tail passed between her legs, before taking its place draped around her hips. She belted her armored shirt around her waist, hiding her tails from view. It added a little bulk to her lower body, but not enough to be obvious. How long are they? Shinji asked. Kayla paused. I haven't exactly measured them, Kayla shrugged. They get shorter when I flex my tail muscles, so it varies. If I had to guess, I'd put the range between 6 and 8 feet. She adjusted the lay of the armored wrap skirt, before continuing. That's pretty elaborate armor, Shinji said as he watched her strapping the corners of each side of the skirt around her calves. It doesn't look like it was made for you. It was, Kayla said with a sigh, but that was before I had tails. Questions raced through his mind, but he said nothing. What group are you with? Kayla asked as she made final adjustments to the straps. Or are you just a starport employee? Alliance forces, Shinji answered. Shadow Brigade, specifically. Shadow Brigade, Kayla said with amusement. How long have you been? Ever since I turned 16. How old are you now? 22, Shinji answered and then added, would you mind if I ask you how old you are, Lady Darkseid? Biologically, I'm 20. Kayla answered with the sudden realization that she'd be older than Vance when her brother returns. Time travel is weird like that, she mused, then, realized he'd heard her thought, but not the context. She added aloud, long story, don't ask. I won't, he said with the added thought, I guess it explains why you're so much younger than I expected. I guess I shouldn't ask why you specified that it's your biological age either. I wouldn't recommend it, Kayla chided. So, what's next on the agenda? I have to take you to the registration office, Shinji said, as he led her out of the decontamination area, and down a hallway. We usually use genetic scanners to verify visitors are who they claim to be. Telepathic validation is virtually unheard of, but I'm guessing that's how you've kept your true identity a secret for all these years. When we first received your instructions, we were all a little shocked. It was unorthodox, but nobody seemed to mind that. I mean, Lady Darkseid, coming here. That's such a huge deal to people like us. Kayla flashed him a confused look. You know, he continued, regular people. Kayla reached over and patted him on the butt. You call that regular? While he was startled, Kayla slipped through his mental defenses and gently scanned his mind. The title she'd been given was famous or infamous, depending on who you asked. Lady Darkseid had been referenced in correspondence between some of the most influential people in all of Corrales, yet nobody seemed to know who she actually was. What? Kayla asked playfully. Do you think I would have let you see my tails if I didn't like yours? Maybe not, but my tail is only metaphorical, Shinji teased. She withdrew from his mind, unnoticed, while he was focused on the memory of running his fingers through her fur. It wasn't the thought she expected him to focus on, but it served the purpose.